everybody. Welcome to this extraordinary meeting of the Standards and General Purposes Committee. The meeting has been called to discuss the proposed changes to the size, composition and terms of reference of Waverley Borough Council's committees. The recommendations by this committee will then be discussed at full council, which is taking place at 7 p.m. this evening. My name is Councillor Andy MacLeod and I'm chairman of this committee. I'm accompanied by my Vice Chair, Councillor John Rubini. Leila, can I ask if there have been any apologies for absence?
Okay. Yeah, sorry, apologies were received from Councillor Janet Crow.
Thank you. I understand that there's a member of the committee who's been just appointed, Ken Reid, for filling the vacancy that there was in the committee. So welcome, Ken. The first agenda item is the proposed size and composition in terms of reference of our committees. And I'm going to hand over. Oh, declarations of interest. Sorry, that wasn't there. Can I ask if there's anyone who wants to make any declaration of interest? There's none received, I understand.
None received. Okay,
thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Susan Sale, who is the Executive Head of Legal and Democratic Services, to introduce the officer's report.
Thank you, Chair. So councillors will recall that on the 23rd of May, when full council met, they referred this matter to the Standards and General Purposes Committee to consider some changes to the Waverley Borough Council constitution. Some of the proposed changes are arising from the change to the number of councillors, which went from 57 to 50 members, and others are relating to the way in which the council discharges its planning functions and the size, composition and remit of its planning committees. Members will have the papers in front of them and I'm sure will have read the report. In terms of the first issues that we wanted to bring to your attention, the first 4 recommendations before you, 2.1.1, 2.1.2, 2.1.3 and 2.1.4, the reason for those is really to reflect the reduction in number of councillors. So recommendation 2.1.1 is seeking the committee's agreement to propose to full council that the name of the audit committee is renamed the Audit and Risk Committee, and that is simply to better reflect the terms of reference of that committee. The Constitution makes very clear that risk is a key element of the remit of the committee. And then the following 3 recommendations are relating to the size and composition of various committees. So it's being proposed that the Audit Committee reduces from 8 councillors to 7, that the Standards and General Purposes Committee reduces from 9 councillors to 7, and that the Licensing and Regulatory Committee be reduced from 12 councillors to 11, and that the Constitution be amended to reflect that reduction in numbers. Recommendation 2.2 before you relates to proposed changes to the Planning Committee, and the report sets out officer advice, and my colleague Claire Upton Brown is here this evening to provide some advice to you, as are some colleagues from the Planning Advisory Service who are online to assist as well. You're asked to consider various options for planning committees, including whether you want to retain 2 geographical committees, change to 2 non-geographical committees, or go down to 1 committee, and if so, the number of members you would want on those planning committees, and some considerations around the number of seats, the name of the committee, whether you would want executive members to be within that membership or not, mandatory training requirements, arrangements for substitutes and arrangements for speaking by ward members on applications within their ward area. So on that note, I'll pass over to my colleague Claire Upton Brown, who can give you a little bit more advice and information about the planning proposals.
Thank you, Susan. So as Susan set out, the report does set out some options. And this afternoon, I can only strongly suggest to you that you go with the option of a single planning committee. And the reasons why I'm suggesting to you are as follows. For members that have been on the council for some time, you'll be familiar that this authority has actually had 2 visits by the Planning Advisory Service, first in 2018 and the second in 2022. The Planning Advisory Service, part of the Local Government Association, are a body that are there to support planning authorities perform their function. And they only come and visit councils if they've identified a problem. In 2018, I understand there was a problem with the quality of decisions that the council were making, and then in 2022, which you're all now familiar with the problem of performance was identified. On both occasions, the Planning Advisory Committee made comment about the efficiency of having more than one committee, and suggested that the most efficient way for a council of this size, with the volume of applications that come through the planning function, it was appropriate to have a single committee. We're obviously now in the situation where we've had 2 letters from DLUC. The first saying that we were on a list of 17 councils considered for designation. The second on the 12th of April saying we're now on a list of 10 authorities, and designation was very high on the cards for Waverley, together with 9 other authorities. So I guess from my point of view, I put myself in the shoes of DLUC and also Michael Gove in making this decision. You've got a council here that's had strong advice from the Planning Advisory Service on 2 occasions over a 4-year period, advising them that the most efficient way for them to deliver their planning function was to go to a single committee. A relatively simple step for us all to take, but that advice had not been taken. And as officers, I think we will have to explain probably again to DLUC why that advice hasn't been taken as a simple measure to help us deliver our planning function in a more effective way. So in terms of from officer side, obviously I'm new, and I've identified, which I don't think is new news, not only a performance issue, but I think there is a cultural issue that needs to change in the way we're working with you as members. And whilst it's without doubt that officers and members don't always agree about planning matters, nevertheless, we are a single team. We have to have that space to understand each other and also have those disagreements sometimes about planning matters that isn't necessarily at the end of the day, which is in the planning committee. And ultimately, we are one team. We're here to deliver the local plan and actually support delivery of sustainable future communities, to support the economy and to protect and enhance our environment for the coming decades and future generations. Again, from my point of view, to make some of these cultural changes, we really do need some capacity, and running multiple committees per month means that our time and resource is focused on servicing those committees, which will not give us space to do the things that we need to do. And similarly for you as members, you'll be attending meetings rather than maybe being involved at a much earlier stage and sharing some of your concerns about some of the schemes that we are asked to consider by developers, some of which haven't been shaped through sort of pre-app and so forth. So just to sort of close off, I just wanted to share some statistics with you to just give you a picture of what things look like. So it's only a couple of slides, so I'm not going to bore you with endless PowerPoint, and I'm going to hope the slides come up. So my experience previously in local government, I've worked for a number of authorities, is usually you'd have 12 meetings a year. So for the number of meetings we've held over the last 3 years, you'll see, it's up to 35 meetings. And then just in terms of the performance, if we just go to the next slide. So within those committees, we've had sort of a significant number of applications overturned at times, with appeals being allowed. Now, whilst the number is quite high on one of the committees, the actual number of overturns is very, very low. So one of the committees is performing much more effectively as a committee than the other committee. And therefore, as a result of that, you know, the residents, applicants, businesses within this district, within this borough, you know, are receiving a completely different experience from us as a single council. So, you know, I think we've heard in lots of different contexts, postcode lottery. I think this probably isn't, the same can be applied to running the two Eastern and Western committees. So I'll take that slide down now, and thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Next item is to bring forward our speakers. We have 7 speakers who had registered to speak, and each has 4 minutes to speak. The first one, who's actually online on Zoom, is Councillor Peter Clark. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Chair. When the council became liable for designation for not meeting the government's 70% threshold for the determination of non-majors, the Chief Executive, Tom Horwood, wrote to the Director of Planning at DLUC. In his letter, he outlined 3 exceptional circumstances that led to the designation liability. And he also included 14 actions the council was undertaking following a review by the Planning Advisory Service. None of these involved any reforms to our planning committee structure. The performance of the council during the last 3 quarters has easily exceeded the 70% target, but as it's a 2-year rolling target, our overall achievement is just still above the threshold. So we must be vigilant and ensure that everything possible is done to free up more officer time. At last month's planning induction for councillors, led by Gillian McInnes, she stated very clearly that the main threat now facing the council was the quality performance on major applications, whereby applications for 10+ dwellings that are refused were being overturned on appeal. When PAS made reference to the number of planning committees at Waverley in paragraph 7.1 of their report, apart from recommending a review, they did not make any specific recommendations. Their recommendations were focused upon the internal performance of the planning team. All that being said, whether it be speed or quality or a combination of the two, the planning department and the structure of committees both have a role to play if we are going to move away from designation territory. It would seem to me that if we have 2 planning committees, whether they be Western or Eastern, or whether they be A and B, it seems unjust if it is more likely that applications are refused by consideration by one committee or another. Going to a single committee comprising of 15 members would be a more equitable position for applicants. However, we have heard numerous voices on the subject of local knowledge. And if we were to abolish geographical committees, but local knowledge is not just about your local neighbourhood, it is also about knowledge of your neighbourhood plan and how to use it effectively in making proper decisions on planning applications. This is especially important, reflecting upon the 2 recent appeals in Farnham that were dismissed by 2 different inspectors who made numerous references to Farnham's robust neighbourhood plan not being undermined. The Farnham Residents Group are a geographical party. Our name kind of gives the game away. And of course, we represent our wards and the borough. But if we are to have a mandate, we also have a mandate, from the electorate to effectively represent the town of Farnham. So I'm pleased to see that the single planning committee option would have 4 of our members serve, with the possibility of 2 Farnham councillors from other parties serving as well. With the addition of annual rotating chairs between Farnham residents and Liberal Democrats, The single committee option with 15 members is one that can deliver the local knowledge of Farnham and its neighbourhood plan, which is also important. Those that think that making committee reforms will resolve all the issues we are facing are wrong. There is still work to be done elsewhere, for example, on the weight given by officers to the neighbourhood plans, as the planning inspector certainly did at the 2 hearings I mentioned earlier. Shortage of experienced offers is one thing, and achieving government planning performance targets is another. But the committees and the officers both have a role to play together in achieving planning excellence. And in the immortal words of the Farnham Residents founder, it's what our residents expect from us. In conclusion, one of the corporate objectives of this council is to provide effective strategic planning and development to meet the needs of our communities. Therefore, I support one planning committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Councillor PA David Beeman. And if we can ensure that the timer starts straight away this time. I think Peter got an extra minute or so. He was lucky. If we can stick to the 4 minutes this time, over to you, Councillor Beeman.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll try and keep it below 4 minutes if I can. All right. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Standards and General Purposes Committee regarding the proposed changes to the size composition in terms of reference of Waverley Borough Council's committees. I'd like to address the committee both as a member for Farnham North West Ward and Chair of Western Area Planning Committee. My comments are also only related to the proposal relating to the planning committees. Setting aside the procedural issues under which these changes were first sought to be implemented, for which I am thankful to Councillor Hyman for drawing attention, which is now being corrected through this meeting, with recommendations being discussed in the extraordinary meeting of full council is being held tonight. I recognise and appreciate the concern over the possibility of Waverley losing its planning powers over speed of processing and determining applications. Although I understand, as pointed out by Councillor Clark, the performance being achieved is now well in excess of the central government's 70% threshold. My concern relates to the threat that exists to Waverley losing its planning powers over issues of quality. Apart from the fact that it seems fundamentally wrong to define quality as an arbitrary percentage of the total appeals allowed, there appears to be some misconception about the performance of the Western Committee. I undertook a detailed analysis of the performance of the Western and Eastern Committees, which revealed that since the 1st of January 2022, the Western determined 48 applications, whilst Eastern determined 49. Of these applications, Western members overturned officer recommendations to approve on 17 occasions, with 7 going to appeal, of which 5 have been allowed. We're still awaiting to be decided. The comparative figure for Eastern are 11 applications refused overturning officer recommendation to approve, of which only 2 have been subject to appeal. In Western's performance of the 5 appeals allowed, only 1 was related to a major development, Hawthorns, in the Farnham area, and 4 relate to minor applications in areas outside Farnham, mainly in the Aylesbury area. I will, however, accept that in recent months there have been a number of refusals made by Western overturning officer recommendations to approve in relation to major proposals for development on land that is not allocated in Farnham's neighbourhood plan, now that its 2-year protection period is over. I would, however, like to point out that when decisions to refuse applications for development on land not allocated in the neighbourhood plan, they've always been taken with support of from all political groups, so changing the structure of the planning committees would not have changed the decisions that have been made. Nevertheless, in order to avert the potential threat of designation, I recognise that some changes need to be made. It is my view that the proposed 2 non-geographic planning committees, A and B, would create more problems than it would resolve. In particular, there is potential for unnecessary conflict over allocation of applications, and a similar system that has been tried before was found wanting. If there has to be changed, then I would personally favour the creation of 1 single planning committee covering all of Waverley. This would remove the inconsistencies that currently exist between Western and Eastern committees. To be successful, however, the following other changes would need to be made. There would need to be at least 6 Farnham councillors on any single planning committee of 15 members, and the rules regarding call-ins by members should be reviewed, giving further delegated powers to officers in respect of minor planning applications. Finally, I fully support the proposal that executive members should be prohibited from being members of planning committees. I also fully support the proposal that members of planning committees should not be allowed to vote on any application in the ward. They should, however, retain the right to speak for up to 4 minutes before and 4 minutes after the debate, as other councillors who are ward members but not members of the planning committee, since this will remove any potential accusations of predetermination and give councillors, whether or not they're members of the planning committee, the freedom to support or object to any planning application in the ward. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The next speaker is Councillor Jerry Hyman. Is Jerry in the room or online?
I'm online now.
He's
Yeah, Chair.
online. Okay, over to you then, Jerry.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I've been slightly confused by what's been said so far, because this started as a recommendation for two councils, A and B, that were no longer geographical, and as without any warning, as far as I can tell, or any recommendation, has become one of, should we have one planning committee? And I don't see anything at all, as Councillor Clark has said, that justifies in the Planning Advisory Service reports that any changes to the planning committees. I myself consider that, as we had a planning development management improvement plan come before us in 2021 with a briefing, as there are a load of recommendations by the PAS within the documents that we've got in front of us here, and I refer to page 21 in particular of your documents, Mr. Chairman. We can see that the problems actually were caused. The problems we've got at the moment were very much caused by the failure of staff to write to the developers asking for extensions. That's what's caused the problem that we've got in terms of possible designation. Combined also, of course, with the backlog caused by the Horizon system, which wasn't councillors' fault in any way, as far as I can tell. That was just a poorly handled software update, which has been solved, and also COVID and working from home. That's what the gentleman Peter Ford, who's with us now, I think is has told us that were the problems and the cause of the issues we've got here. And I'm not denying that we've got problems in the planning system. I've been through the toolkits. I don't know whether anybody else has had time to do so. I made time to go through and look at the questions that are being asked, or that the councils are suggested they ask themselves. I've had absolutely no report go through services ONS, as far as I can tell, updating the progress of the Development Management Improvement Plan. That should go to ONS before we make any knee-jerk reactions, as far as I'm concerned, and take any decisions which we're likely to regret and which could very much alienate our residents. We do have to justify our decisions, and the Standards Board is the one which has to make sure that we are acting in accordance with our constitution. So I ask members to very much respect the fact that their decision making tonight and ours at council later does have to accord with, but it's on page 34 of the Constitution, Article 12, Part 2 of the Constitution, regarding decision making. In particular, the principles of decision making is paragraphs F to I, F, G, H, and I apply. They say we have to have proper consideration of written reports. Well, there's nothing in this report which talks about a single change to a single planning committee. There's no justification for it. That relevant matters are fully considered in decision making. Nothing irrelevant is taken into account, so that should limit what people talk about this evening. Hopefully, that the Constitution is fully complied with, so you have to stick to this, and that decisions are recorded by officers and published with the reasons. So we have to be able to justify any decision that's made, and I've seen nothing in these papers that justifies a decision to change from where we are at the moment. And I would very much warn against changes which have been tried before here and elsewhere. We've got a system at the moment that works. We've been presented with some slides, a couple of slides that have fleeted past us, which appear to compare apples with pears. We've got numbers on one side and percentages on the other, and I found that impossible to understand what we're actually being told. I'd like to know, I'd like to see that, and I think this should go to ONS. The whole Development Management Improvement Plan should go to ONS, so we can look at whether or not the proposal that we've just had put in front of us for one committee is actually justified by the facts and the evidence. Because I see nothing here, and we're being told it's good.
Can you wrap up now, please?
Absolutely. Apologies, Chairman. Yes. So I'm fully in favour of numbers, changing the numbers from 15 to 11 of the two committees, but would suggest we retain ask members to retain the committees as they are until we've been able to look at proper solutions to the planning problems we've got, because what's put in front of us is not a solution to the problem we've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. The next speaker is Councillor Peter Martin. Peter. At the back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to say that the first recommendations on the Audit and Risk Committee, the Audit Committee, and the reductions in the numbers and the changes to the Licensing Regulatory Committee, those changes I have no issues with. I am only opposed to the planning changes. What we have here are radical changes to scrap the geographically based committees, which operated successfully for most of the 12 years of the administration, the Conservative administration, which concluded 4 years ago. And indeed, at the very beginning of that administration, we had a sort of A and B system, didn't like it and scrapped it, most councillors at that time. And since then, during that administration, and most of the administration over the last 4 years have favoured a geographically based committee structure. The peer review by PAS dated to June 2022 is a year old. I would ask why it's taken so long for that to be released to us. Councillor Follows has said that the report is deeply concerning and yet appears to have sat on it for 12 months, which I find surprising. The peer review report makes 10 recommendations, none of which suggests the scrapping of geographically based committees. Paragraph 7.1 of the PAS report, which is highlighted in the standards report to us, talks of it being unusual to have more than one planning committee. I note the word unusual, which is not to say it's wrong or unacceptable. Being unusual, I would say, is not wrong. And what the PAS report does not acknowledge is the large geographical area that Waverley covers, which indeed is the largest in Surrey. If that point is accepted, then to have more than one planning committee, in my view, is entirely logical. And if that is accepted, then having two planning committees, which are geographically based, is surely right. And that was tested during the 12 years of the Conservative administration. Officer time has been cited as a concern. The standards report does, in fact, suggest not only one committee, but the possibility of two planning committees, namely A and B. I don't really see why two planning committees entitled Eastern and Western should take any more officer time than two committees called A and B. And again, I would stress that this was not a significant issue during the 12 years of the Conservative administration when most of the current structure was put into place. So what are the implications for us as councillors? I think, in my judgment, by removing the geographical element of each planning committee and disbarring local ward members from decisions on applications in their now expanded wards compared to the position pre-May 2023, I do believe that we remove local knowledge and contextual element in the planning process. Waverley councillors are elected by ward precisely because of their activity, their input, their intimate knowledge of their local areas. Geographical knowledge and context is, in my judgment, a vital part of the planning decision process. And losing this, as I believe we will result in a further deterioration of Waverley planning outcomes. If we move to non-geographically based committees with applications from all over Waverley, I think the number of site visits will increase as planning committees seek to better understand sites and locations for planning applications from places and areas with which members are not familiar, which will slow up the planning proposal or process, rather, the reverse of what is required. So, Mr. Chairman, that's what I have to say. I'm very opposed to these non-geographical planning committees and submit my thoughts to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. The next speaker is Councillor Jane Austen.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. I would just like to state I am opposed to these proposed changes. I'm a new councillor, and I first want to state my dismay that to witness on day one in the council chamber this attempt to force through major changes to our planning committees without first going through the proper Standards and General Purposes Committee. In trying to force these changes, Councillor Follows stated the proposals had not been plucked from the ether. Now, here we are at the meeting, and we have only just had disclosure of very basic empirical evidence, no relevant reports to provide any reason or justification for these proposed changes. So we seem to have also moved to one planning committee, and the agenda, there's no provision for the state just maintaining the status quo of two geographical committees. I therefore ask, so I was disappointed. So I did some of my own investigation work. I trawled through the Planning Advisory Service website documents and read all of their model example cases on probity. Nowhere did I see a recommendation to exclude ward members or indeed to make wards non-geographical. I therefore ask, how can the Standards Committee and the EGM later be expected to properly discharge their function without any basis to make a decision and to give justification and reasons for it? I quote the Waverley Constitution, Rights and Duties of a Councillor, 2.3b(1). Councillors shall have such rights of access to documents, information, land and buildings as are necessary for them to discharge their functions properly and in accordance with the law. What we have been provided with is a peer group report, which we now have learned was not disclosed for 12 months to anyone other than council officers. I wonder how my fellow incumbent councillors feel about this. We have no idea what happened after this report. Were any of the recommendations within the report acted upon? 8 months after this report, Waverley was issued a letter to be put on notice of special measures for poor performance. Could this have been avoided? None of this behaviour sits with Waverley's stated corporate objective of open, democratic and participative governance. The proposals have wide-reaching implications for our Waverley residents. Planning committee members have spent, in many cases, years building up their knowledge to understand local issues and the local context. This is how they enrich planning decisions made. They seek to ensure the correct planning decisions are made, and how they minimise referral to appeal and the resulting costs to the taxpayer. As a chartered surveyor myself, I hope to sit on a planning committee and utilise my professional and local contextual experience. I'm well aware of the rules, and if I have a conflict of interest, I will recuse myself. I reached the conclusion that in this administration's efforts to salvage its very poor record on planning, it's attempting to turn Waverley's planning committees into rubber stamping exercises. By excluding ward members and making these wards making committees non-geographical, the net result will be poorer quality decisions for our Waverley residents, more referrals to appeal, and the resulting higher appeal costs.
Thank you, Jen. The next speaker is Councillor James Staunton. Hope I pronounced your name correctly, James.
Staunton, like the chess set.
Apologise if I didn't get it quite right.
Or the T. As a councillor representing the residents of Weston Commons, I cannot see how excluding ward members and making planning committees non-geographic will improve the quality of decisions being made in the ward. In fact, I think it is more likely to damage, debase, and degrade the quality of decisions being made, particularly in a large rural ward such as Weston Commons, a ward that includes 6 districts, 5 civil parishes, and where Thursley alone covers an area of 8 square miles. Councillors sitting in more urban wards in, say, Farnham or Cranley might be expected to have enough local contextual background to reach the right planning decisions in other parts of their town. But you cannot expect a councillor living 27 miles drive from the site to have an intimate working knowledge of a small village like Dockenfield or Spreakley or Pitch Place. I fear making planning committees non-geographical and disbarring ward members from applications in their own wards will disproportionately disadvantage large wards such as Bramley and Wonersh, Whitley and Milford, and Western Commons, a ward so large it makes up roughly a fifth of Waverley. I could be wrong, but I've seen no evidence to justify excluding ward members or making planning committees non-geographic. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Final speaker is Councillor Paul Follows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank you and the committee members who in the background have taken the issues under consideration here today with the seriousness that they deserve. I'd also like to thank the members who are here who are not part of this committee for demonstrating very clearly both the ability for non-committee members to take part, but to do so persuasively and effectively. I'm afraid that the portfolio holder, Councillor Townsend, is unable to be here today, and I know that she would want me to reiterate both her view and of the entire executive that inaction on this subject will not be something that we can easily explain to the government, and that we must not only act, but be seen to act decisively if we hope to avoid designation and the threat of losing our planning powers altogether. Now, in many respects, we're here, and I mean here in the more wider sense of actually being elected councillors, because we'd like to have more say over planning than we actually have. Of course, planning rules, almost chapter and verse, are set by the government, and certainly the framework for which we're able to set what minimal elements of the planning system we're able to determine ourselves are also set by the government. Those rules are also in considerable flux, and that flux is, at this point, met with a sense of I don't know, ennui from the government at this point in terms of actually passing new planning regulations and new requirements. They're very keen to talk about them, but not actually pass them. I'm sure the Conservative members who were here prior to the election, and certainly as long ago as 2018, will remember some of the things that they so generously passed on to us in 2019 and have neglected to remember the origins of, but I'm sure their conscience will return to them by the time they get to council this evening. But I would like to reiterate my support for the prohibition of ward members voting on applications in their ward, but crucially also, as part of this process, highlighting and championing their rights to speak at the beginning and end of applications without fear of predetermination. Now, Councillors Martin and Staunton have, in my opinion, grossly misrepresented what is being actually proposed here by saying that ward councillors are being excluded from the discussion. They're not at all. And actually, I think it underestimates the power of a free ward councillor to properly represent their residents in such decision-making. Now, I also completely support the prohibition of executive members from planning committees because there is an even wider potential for predetermination or perception of predetermination from executive members. Now, many members have had discussion with me separately on this since the 23rd, and I am convinced actually that one committee would allow local knowledge to be deployed appropriately to all applications that come before a committee. Changes to committees are strongly implied by the recommendations from past. They are the solution to many of the other issues that are defined in there. And it's my hope certainly that the Standards Committee will in due course pick up the, I think, at least as serious issue of dealing with the delegations of authority, which are actually at the root of a lot of the work that is having to be done quite unnecessarily by officers at this point. I think I'd also just like to remind members as well, when we're talking about the impossibility of a single planning committee and a single set of councillors representing the vast territory that is Waverley Borough Council, that the single Planning and Regulatory Committee of Surrey County Council deals with the vast territory by comparison of the entirety of Surrey. And of course, members of that committee are, of course, obliged to go and look at applications outside of their particular division. Indeed, with 80 members of the County Council, the vast majority of members of Surrey County Council also aren't members of that planning committee and actually still manage to find the ability to weigh in appropriately on those applications across a territory far larger and more complicated than the borough of Waverley. Mr. Chairman, I would also humbly suggest that the committee may wish to formally add some form of recommendation that empowers you, the Standards Committee, to bring whatever is agreed at council tonight back within, say, a period of 1 year for a sober and reasonable reflection. But I would again just finish by saying that the executive in particular are keen to avoid a planning determination against us, a designation against us, where we lose what little powers we actually have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Paul. Well, members, we now have to discuss the various issues ourselves. I'd like to structure the discussion a little bit. Susan at the beginning referred to the three committees, the Audit Committee, the Standards and General Purpose Committee and the Regulatory Committee. And it seems that these recommendations are like recommendations relating to the planning committees. So if we can take each of these one in turn, do any members have anything to say about the recommendations in terms of the audit committee? Firstly, that the membership should be reduced from 8 to 7, and secondly, that the name should be changed to the Audit and Risk Committee. The alternatives are to leave the committee at the same size it currently is, or to actually just leave it with the same name it has. Do any members wish to speak on this item? Councillor Nicholson.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a brief point. The Audit Committee, I think the Risk Committee, Audit and Risk is a better description, which is fine. I remember actually being on the Audit Committee when it first started in 2006. There were 5 members then, and it worked perfectly well. So it's perfectly reasonable to have the numbers we have now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak on this item? So are we agreed with the officer's recommendations that we should reduce the committee, the audit committee, from 8 to 7 councillors, and we agreed to change the name to the Audit and Risk Committee?
Agreed.
We agreed to that. Okay, if we can now take the second committee, which is our own committee, the Standards and General Purposes Committee. The single recommendation here is that the size should be reduced from 9 councillors to 7 councillors. And has any member anything you would like to say about that, either in support or against? Councillor Ward.
It's slightly oblique, Mr. Chairman, but I will support the recommendation. But could I ask you, when we get to the somewhat tetchy area of planning, that you are indulgent in time and allowing people to speak second, because I think 28 minutes, 3 minutes each for 9 people is not enough to discuss that item. I mean, you could head off to 24.4 of suspending the standing orders, but I think it would be better to rely on your indulgence. But apart from that, I'm happy.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll take your advice on that. So are we agreed with the recommendation that we reduce this committee from 9 to 7 members?
Agreed.
Do we agree? Thank you. We now come to the Licensing and Regulatory Committee, and the recommendation here is reduced from 12 councillors to 11 councillors. Would anyone like to speak on that? So are we agreed with that recommendation?
Agreed.
Agreed. Good, good, good. So we now come to the tricky, much more tricky subject of the planning committees. The officers have put forward 2 recommendations, one or 2 proposals really. One that we go to the single committee, which the head of service, the head of the executive head of planning development has recommended we go to the single committee. So we've got these 2 options to discuss. But there is also the option of the status quo. The status quo does exist. That is actually what the council set in motion at the moment. We have 2 planning committees in East and Western with 15 members each. So that is something we can discuss. So I'll throw it open to discussion actually, for, starting with Councillor Goodrich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Seems to me that the problems that this council have are 2 in connection with planning: the speed of delivering planning decisions and the quality of the decisions, particularly on major applications, which was clear when we had the training from the excellent officer from PAS, which we had last month. The appendix that has been in secret until we had it disclosed to us in June 22 seems to only deal with speed only and doesn't seem to deal with quality. What amazes me to start with, which may, and it's been said, I think, by Councillor Hyman, was that it says in the report, paragraph 2.7 on page 20, that in response to these performance issues, the council took a conscious decision to not seek extensions of time in the majority of cases. Why and who took that decision? Because I wasn't aware of it. Whether the leader was, whether the then portfolio for planning did. But you know, it says here that the council took a conscious decision. I was on the council for years and never has that come before us so far as I'm aware. And when this report was received in June 22, was something done about it then, or has it still been gathering dust on a shelf and is now urgent? I don't know. The problem is we need facts and evidence to decide the solution. Now, before a decision on solutions can be made, we've had some indication on the number of appeals, but we have no information as how many appeals were there on officer decisions under delegated powers, how many appeals were there on non-determination, how many appeals were made by a committee following an officer's recommendation, and how many appeals were on the committee refusing against an officer recommendation. And we need that really to find out where it's going wrong so we can sort out the problem. And I know for Easton, for example, that we had an application for a house in Shamley Green to be demolished and to rebuild. And they had an extant permission to do an extension, which they hadn't started. We were advised by the then head of planning that we must refuse it. We must refuse it. And despite it being counterintuitive to do so, because he said if they'd started the extension, that would have been fine, but they haven't started the extension, so it's not fine. We did as we were told. We were responsible and we refused it, went on appeal and they won the appeal. So, you know, I think we need to know where the problem is because it's not necessarily members. I don't say it's necessarily officers either, but it may be a combination. And I would certainly wish to encourage as much conversation between officers and members and ward members in particular. So as well, there's no evidence before us to support the abolishing of geographic committees and no evidence to support ward councillors not to debate or vote. Yes, they can give a statement at the beginning, they can give a statement at the end, and in my ward, which covers, I don't know how many square miles, with 6 villages, 4 parish councils, and Uncle Tom probably and all, there are 3 ward members, and all 3 of us may wish to speak on matters within our particular area. But there's no evidence to support that. There's nothing I can see from PAS unless there's another document that's been hidden somewhere which we haven't seen, but there's no evidence to support it. What surprises me, and of course my knowledge goes back to the last century, or the 1900s anyway, but at the beginning of around about 26, 27, we introduced Committee A and B. We did that very thing. It proved to be an absolute disaster in that the elected members didn't like it at all for the very reasons that they couldn't be involved so much on their own patch. And secondly, the members of the public hated it because they just felt that the people they knew who they'd been discussing it with, and with proper training, predetermination isn't going to happen. I've never known it happen on the 28 years I've been on this council to predetermine anything. But it didn't work. So why should it work now? And we've heard, you know, from some Farnham residents about how their raison d'etre for being there would be taken away if they couldn't vote on Farnham matters. I repeat what Councillor Martin said very briefly, that more site visits will arise. I see somewhere on the report they're talking about no site visits unless the chairman and vice chairman on advice from the officer decide it's necessary. So we'll be getting rid of site visits, which are a nuisance because people might know more about it than they should.
I will have to learn all about if I was on the planning committee, the Farnham Development Plan, which blissfully I haven't had to look at because I don't have to deal with applications in Farnham. If we had one committee, they're going to have to know all the development plans in detail. I think the quality would be worse. If in an ideal world, what I would like is what we had pre-COVID, which is one main planning committee, which deals with all the major planning applications, which has the best qualified, whether they be surveyors or whether they be councillors for a long time, whatever the best people are, to decide planning applications, together with 2 area committees to deal with the minor applications. But I would certainly not be in favour of one committee without the area committees below them. One thing that hasn't been raised, which I think would improve our performance, and I'm surprised no one suggested it, is to improve our procedure. And I'm particularly referring to part 4.2 of the Constitution, paragraphs 210 and 211, which set out the procedures on a planning committee, which says the first thing you do is vote on the officer's recommendation, which in the case of officer recommending approval, you vote on. And then if it's lost, then you put an alternative proposal. At the training, the training officer was very helpful and constructive and said what really should happen is if the chairman senses that things aren't going the way the officers are recommending, that no vote is taken on the officer's recommendation, an alternative motion is taken with all the reasons for refusal. So we don't have a situation which I found myself in the past where jolly merrily people vote against the officer's recommendation because they don't like it. I've not supported them, incidentally, and voted with the officers. It's then passed, and then they look at each other and think, right, now we've got to think of some reasons to refuse. Now, that is wrong, is bad planning, but would be contrary to our constitution unless we change it. And I do think that we need to change that. And whether, Chairman, you accept a change to the planning procedure rules or you want me to formally propose it, but I do think that would make a difference. I'm wanting to try and be positive at the same time as keeping the area committees, but to try and have some changes which will be in accordance of the evidence we did have from the PAS. I'm not going to start drafting the wording because the monitoring officer and people better qualified than I can do it, but it is on page 343 of the Constitution. If I've got the latest, yes, October 22 version, the paragraphs 2.10 and 2.11 need changing. And if that is supported by the committee generally, then I think that would be better, because certainly we are advised very strongly that the current system, which specifically says the chair will move the officer's recommendation as set out in the report as amended by the committee if applicable, and the committee will vote on that recommendation. If a motion to approve the officer's recommendation fails, the chair will invite the planning committee with an alternative recommendation, which is totally contrary to what we're advised would be good practice. So I would very much be in favour of trying to sort that out rather than tinkering around with the committees, which I don't think will solve the problem. And there's no evidence to say it will sort out the problem.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Goodrich. I wonder, Claire, if we could try and get an answer to some of Councillor Goodrich's queries and questions about the Planning Advisory Service report. As I understand it, actually, the problems related, and it's made clear in the report from the Planning Advisory, to the period between January 20 and December 21. So it's actually a historical period. And as I understand, things are getting a great deal better now. In terms of the specific questions, it's a bit unfair to ask you who exactly decided. You haven't been here long enough, but you may be able to tell us who you think decided on the what proved to be a mistake. It's fairly clear in the Planning Advisory Service report. It was a mistake not to ask for time extensions, and I'm sure we're not doing that any longer. But if you could respond first of all on that item.
Yeah, so in terms of the extension of times, that is a officer decision about how they run a service, not a member decision. I can't confirm why that confusion happened. It may well be over the COVID period where people working remotely and possibly a turnover of staff, that message had got lost. So I'm not able to tell you exactly why that happened, but it may be over that very, very difficult period. I know certainly myself running a planning service somewhere else, where you were having to suddenly work remotely, officers were out and about on site when the rest of the world wasn't even allowed to leave their back garden. Messages did get lost. I think it is an important point that this isn't a new problem, and the quality thing isn't a new problem because of the way statistics and the government measure our performance. It's a rolling period over 2 years, so it isn't something that's suddenly happened. It's as a consequence of something that happened some time ago. And we're trying to now rectify the situation. There has been a number of measures put in place over a period of time. Performance has been above the government target for consecutive quarters. And over the last quarter, we put in a series of other measures to ensure that we continue to maintain that performance despite losing staff. And similarly for this quarter that will end at the end of June, we've got another set of measures in place to ensure that we exceed the government 70% performance, and to respond to the letter from DLUHC.
Thank you, Claire. I mean, the Planning Advisory Service made a whole series of recommendations, 10 in fact. And is it correct that most of these have been implemented?
Yes, that is correct. And it possibly is worth also just confirming that the Planning Advisory Service are an advisory service. They aren't actually empowered to come in and make changes or say you absolutely have to. They are giving councils advice on how best to look at the things they do to ensure that they meet both speed and quality targets.
So in fact, I think it's true that we're unlikely to suffer designation as a result of this historical problem. In terms of the relevance to the committee structure, if you read the Planning Advisory Service report carefully, they make a whole series of recommendations. They do refer to the committee structure as it would be helpful to have fewer committees. And that's, I guess, in terms of our consideration here. This particular report was referred to minor applications as well, ones that are mainly decided by officers, in fact, although some of them do come to committees. And so there's a limited degree to which the threat of designation relates to this restructuring of the committees, but it does relate to it in terms of the recommendations from the Planning Advisory Service. It'd be helpful to fewer committee meetings. So I don't know if that helps, Michael, in terms of your questions about the PS.
Yes, to an extent, but the fact of the matter is that Waverley Borough Council, not district, as it says in this report, is different than a lot of councils in that we have 4 centres right on the perimeter of the borough. I mean, it's very different from Guildford, where one can see the logic of having one committee because it's all concentric on the town. Here it's not. And in fact, pre-COVID, we had 4 area committees. Now, I'm not suggesting we do that because it was cumbersome. But and it could be said that if the currently we're now better than we were and everything's hunky-dory now, why do we need to change the committees at all?
Okay.
But
Yes,
I would welcome any comment about my suggestion about changing the procedure rules.
Do you have any comments on that, Claire?
So I think there's two comments I'd just like to sort of share with you, and I hate saying this, but in my previous authority, I've just come from an authority that had 6 towns, a population of 209,000 people, and spanned, it's the largest district in the country, and we ran one planning committee, a single planning committee, very effectively, and actually had that at a membership of 15. So in terms of the voting procedure, I think we do need to be clear on voting, because similarly, I've sat at committees before where everybody's got confused around voting, lost emotion, and then realised that they were there with a refusal with no reason. So I think that's something that we can reflect on to make sure that we have got a robust position on that.
Thank you, Claire. I think you've corrected actually one point that Councillor Martin made. He suggested that the 2 committees went back to the previous Conservative administration. My recollection was that we did have 4 area committees then, as well as the Joint Planning Committee. And the 2 committees came in as a result of COVID, essentially, early on in this administration, or the previous version of this administration. So there we go. Would any other member like to come in now and speak? Councillor John Ward.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence over time. I had quite a well-structured speech, I thought, which would fit quite nicely, and I've been scribbling like mad since I've heard some very pertinent and useful comments from speakers. Can I deal with the easy things first, at least easy for me, and then come back to the crunch on numbers? Ward members not voting at committees and not sitting on them for things on their ward, I think is an excellent idea, and I will tell you why. If I go to, and this has happened to me quite often, to see a client, I was going to say, that's the wrong word, one of my ward members who has a problem for something, let's say, like their next door neighbour's extension. And I walk in the door and, oh, thank goodness you've come. Can you help me with this? And can you support me in my objection to next door? And the first thing I have to say is take a deep breath and say, well, actually, I'm on the planning committee, so I cannot tell you right now that I am going to support your objection. Otherwise, I am potentially landing myself in hot water and potentially finding that, you know, this will not go well for your objection. The look of disappointment that comes over their face is palpable, because they've asked this wonderful councillor, that's me, into their house to help them. And suddenly the first thing he says is, well, I can't actually do what you want me to do. Now, if I'm not on the planning, or if I'm not going to debate it on the planning committee, I can say to him, yes, of course I will, if I don't like it, that is, and say, right, I will roll up my sleeves and I will bat for you. And you then double the time that you have to address the planning committee. You've got 4 minutes in advance to lay the scene, and you've got 4 minutes at the end before the vote to pick up all the stray things that have happened, answer queries, correct things that have gone wrong. I think it saves a huge amount of embarrassment to the people on the committee. I think it saves a huge amount of disappointment to the people we go and visit. And I think it is an excellent idea. Moving on, a one-year review was mentioned. And I certainly think that any changes we make today, which are being made, let us be fair, not necessarily on the evidence in this report, which I have to say I'm not very happy with, but are being made because we are under pressure from government. I think we have to be seen to be doing things. Government is distant, looks at statistics, lots of bits of paper, has little advisors running around telling them what to do. And if we go to them and say, well, actually, no, we've had an election, we've changed all the people on our committees, this is going to move forward, it's going to be better, they won't care. But if we can go to them and say, we've done something radical, and I'll come to that later, then I think, you know, we have a better chance of hauling our feet a bit further away from the fire. But I would certainly, in whatever we say, like to see a one-year review of what we've done so that we can come back and say, yes, what can we do? There was a comment about committees A and B, and a long time ago when I was a young councillor, we had A and B. 2007, I think, when Ken was a little older and I was a bit younger, but it was hated by everybody. Councillor Goodrich was absolutely right. Somehow the right things never went to the right committees. The people on the committees were never happy. You were never sure when you, as a councillor, went to see one of your ward members, you were never sure if you were going to be on that committee, because you might be on committee A, but it might go to committee B. So again, you couldn't say to these people, I'm going to help you in case you predetermined yourself. It was a mess. And I would totally and utterly oppose A and B. I think it would be dreadful. Site visits, I agree, is a potential problem in having one committee on a large area as Waverley. And I think the only way that can be overcome is by members of the planning committee building up trust with each other, and people who are not so familiar with the area relying on the local knowledge, not necessarily the opinions, but the local knowledge of the people who come from there. And I think if we can build up trust within planning, within members of the committee, then we can help that a lot. Just an aside that I scribbled down was something that someone said some time ago. I was going to say, as most of you know, but actually, as most of you probably don't know, I chaired the two central and southern, western and southern committees. I was either chair or vice chair of them for 6 years. So I sat up there through numerous applications. And I also at one time chaired the joint planning committee. And I remember something particularly vexatious was going on about what we could and couldn't do. And I made a comment then, for which I was mildly ticked off afterwards, but I didn't pay any attention to it, when I said, we are no longer a planning committee, we are a permit issuing authority. And to an extent, planning committees have been that for some time. And I don't think, well, it may have got a bit worse recently, but that's a long-term problem. Okay, let's get on to the juicy bits of what's going on. As I said, and as I think Councillor Goodrich raised, when we talk about planning, we're looking at hard evidence and not hearsay and sort of vague innuendos or whatever. And I have to say, I am not happy with this report. But interestingly enough, when you read it and the past document afterwards, the report seems to be pointing the finger of, I won't say blame, but in the direction of the committees, because that's what the report is suggesting we change. In other words, the councillors, whereas the PAS document stuck on the back seems to be pointing the finger at the officers. And one thing I do agree with, which I think Claire said, is we are actually all a team. And we need to, I think, get closer together as officers and members of planning committees and ward members to trust each other more, get to know each other better, and hopefully move this system forward in a rather better way. We are clearly under threat of designation, and we clearly need to do something about it that is demonstrable to those that float around in higher circles in Whitehall. It seems to me from the report and from the PAS document that speed seems to be the main thing to move forward. Yet we hear that, in fact, speed of determination is picking up. So I wonder a little whether that is a necessity to change. However, there is no doubt that we have had a number of appeals granted which we are unhappy with. And again, I think, you know, more content in the reports showing councillors why things like the neighbourhood plan are being, I won't say ignored, but overruled by officers would be helpful, because the neighbourhood plan now seems to be getting the attention of the inspectors. And if it's getting their attention, then that's a good thing to build on and make sure that it works. I understood, and I still believe, the main problem that Waverley has is the sheer volume of applications coming through the door and the higher percentage perhaps than elsewhere that end up in committee. I'm sorry, but I don't buy this. If we cut down the number of committees, the workload will suddenly go away and we'll all be fine. If a planning application comes in the door, it goes through the same process. It has to be verified. It has to be given out to a team or an officer to work on. If it's going to committee, a report has to be produced. The fact that that is going to Eastern Committee or Western Committee or Timbuktu Committee or Joint Planning Committee has no relevance whatsoever on the amount of officer time it takes to produce that report. So I don't buy the fact that reducing the number of committees saves a vast amount of planning officer time. I just don't think it's correct. Leading on from that, you may find this strange coming from me, since one of the first things I did when I was elected leader of this council was to abolish 6 committees, that I would actually quite like personally to go back to something that Councillor Goodrich mentioned, because I do actually value the local knowledge of the area committees. So I would like to see 2 area committees with a joint planning committee. And strange though it is, as I say, having abolished 6 committees, to ask to get one going again may seem a little strange. However, that's my personal view, and it will remain my personal view at the end of this council. However, it is clear that that's not getting much traction amongst many of my fellow councillors. And it is also clear, as I said earlier, that we have to do something radical that we can demonstrate to the department sitting above us. It is also clearly true that Eastern and Western consider things in different ways and do things differently and come to different conclusions. And I am quite convinced that if we changed them to A and B and made them non-geographical, they would still come to different conclusions, because I've been through that system and seen it. Hence, I am surprising myself when I look in the mirror by coming to the conclusion that we should try a single committee. It will remove completely any discrepancies in consideration, and it will allow, hopefully, borough-wide uniformity of decision-making. And as I referred earlier, I think that will help, or I hope it will help, build up trust between members of the committee to say, well, actually, it was a filthy, dirty night, and I didn't really want to go from Cranley all the way to Farnham or vice versa. So for the fact that there is a big hill behind it that water cascades down, or for the fact that there is a bungalow overlooked by it, I will rely on the local councillors to share their local knowledge with me, and then we can make decisions purely on the planning basis. So although I really prefer local committees and I really would like an overview committee, I'm surprising myself by saying I would support the single committee. I would support ward councillors not talking about their own particular things. I would support the executive being banned from planning committees. I would like a review in a year. And I think that's probably the last you're going to hear of me for a while, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Just one thing that I think we could perhaps pick up on, Claire, in terms of what John Ward says. I understand the logic that it doesn't matter how many committees you have, it doesn't add extra to workload in terms of producing reports. But on the other hand, actually, the officers have to support committees. They have to come along in the evening and that sort of thing. And in that sense, it may add to the cost and burden the load on the planning department. And if you could comment, and perhaps it might be helpful to have the comment from the expert from the planning advisory cell that Pete Ford is available to comment as well, if you think that would be helpful, Claire.
Yeah, so I'll start and then Peter, if you want to come in. So in terms of what does that look like? Yeah, you're right, we do, it's a report. It doesn't matter if you send it to 20 committees, it's a single report. However, there's a massive amount of machinery behind producing committee agendas and actually supporting the chair and the planning committee in briefings, the attendance at meetings. Arguably, you'd say, well, the meeting will just be as long as it would have been, but it'll be one meeting rather than two. But I think that there's a tendency, if there's more items on the agenda, sometimes the meetings do become slightly more focused. So in terms of officer time, there would be significantly more time involved in running two committees. And I think there's a sort of an unmeasurable thing around if you're running, so at the moment we're running two committees. So for every week, we've either got a committee or we're preparing an agenda. So other things that you might be trying to achieve during that week can't be achieved because you've got a focus on one of the two, tying up a number of officers. I can't give you statistical information around that, but you know, I do know, and I sort of mapped out in my own diary when I was needing to check reports, when I was needing to do briefings, when I was needing to attend committees, and that's pretty much every week. There is actually a cost as well. Now I have in my mind at some point there was a figure of £7,000 cost to running a planning committee. So if you multiply those, you know, the more committees you run, the more costly it is. Now I can't tell you where I got that figure from or when I had that figure because it's been floating around in my head for some time, so I can't point you to that point. But you know, there is that cost. There's also, you know, democratic services, legal team, and also, you know, and actually it's not for you to decide, but you know, the impact on officers if they're running a whole day at work and then running an evening meeting and then getting up the next day and coming back into the office or their virtual office. So Peter, I don't know whether there's anything you know, you want to add or comment from Paz's experience.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yes, I just want to reiterate a lot of what you said. And just to say that from the Planning Advisory Services point of view, we're certainly not trying to tell you as a council how to run your planning committees, because obviously you know much better than we do. But what we are trying to do, and the reason why the recommendations were there, is we are bringing best practice from throughout the country and sharing that with you so you can see how other committees are run. So the point about the number of items and the you know, the number of times the planning committee sits struck us as unusually high, and that's why it was in the recommendation. And the reason why we say that might be a problem is exactly what Claire was saying. It's the resources that you put into that. So therefore the officer resources, the member resources, and the time, and also the potential delays in decision making, because obviously if something does go to planning committee, there is inevitably a delay whilst that goes to the planning committee, and actually being able to manage the number of items on each agenda. So that's the reason why it was in the report. As I say, we purposely did not say you need to go to one committee or not, because obviously that's for you to make that decision, but it's the number of items, the number of committees that sit, and therefore the resources and time that takes is the reason for that recommendation. Thank you.
Point of information, Chairman. I think I've been slightly misunderstood. To produce a report, I'm quite sure takes the same amount of time, and I think we would agree on that. And I would certainly agree that committees are very time and officer and general frustration intensive. I would like to see less applications through the door, but I have no control over that. Maybe less coming to committee, but if we have 2 committees, I would hope they meet half as often as one committee. So I'm still not 100% convinced on this. If we have one committee, everything will be less, because I think, and I sympathize with the poor people we're going to put on this one committee, they're going to be kind of busy in the next few weeks. If they meet less often than twice as often as the 2 committees, then there's going to be something kind of strange there. So I don't disagree with anything officers are telling me, but I do disagree that 2 committees need to meet as often as one committee does.
I see the logic in your argument. I think Councillor Coburn wishes to speak now.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Always interesting to hear, because, you know, basically we're not all agreed 100% in one way, and we agree with bits of what people are saying and not with others. I remember some training from PAS on defensible decisions. I remember it very, very well. And one thing we were told was that everything had to be plan-led, and that was the important thing. And always you had to have facts, and you had to have good evidence for if a fact was going to be verifiable, you've got to have the evidence. And I'm with Councillor Ward here. I have no evidence for this change, none whatsoever. I know the planning system is failing. I think there's 101 ways we can improve it. But when we had the peer review, which we also had, I'm no good on date, somebody else will remember, when we had the peer review in, I think they were from Cornwall, but I may be wrong, and they walked around watching everything and telling us what to do. And they were horrified at the lack of control of our agendas. That's what they were horrified at, not the fact that we were meeting often or that we weren't delegating enough decisions. Our percentage of decisions at that time being delegated was absolutely fine, and I'm sure it's pretty good now. But what they were saying basically was that we just lose control of our agendas. Now that doesn't involve numbers of committees, that involves numbers of applications. And those applications, if they're managed properly, if the committee system is managed properly, it really doesn't matter whether you have 1, 4, 5 or whatever. But I personally have no evidence whatsoever for changing the current system. I just can't see it. I have been through all the papers over and over again. I remember certainly the site visits, the endless site visits, but very, very useful site visits we had when we first had the single committee. And I wouldn't have missed one for the world, because quite frankly, although I know Farnham, most of Farnham like the back of my hand, I didn't know Cranley and Orfold at all. And I really, now I think I could take you around and show you places. But, you know, at that point in time, these site visits were so essential. But they cost, and, you know, not just money, I'm talking about time and officer time. One of the things I think we need better, various things ought to be better training for both officers and members. We've had the basic training. But if I went round this room now and said, did you know that BE3 is superseded by FMP8? Would you all nod in agreement, or would you think, what the heck's she talking about? But I can remember a young officer phoning me up saying, is there any reason why I shouldn't grant this particular application? And I said, well, it's a difficult one, but it is covered by BE3. And he said, well, what's BE3? So I told him what BE3 was, sent him back to the local plan, and he refused the application. That's now FNP8 for those of you who are going to be on this joint committee, because you need to know that, because it's the same restriction as PE3. And it's all these little subtleties that you learn because you go round and round your own area, and you eventually pick up the policies in Local Plan Part 1, Local Plan Part 2, I'm still working on, I still get confused, and obviously the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan, which I can tell you backwards. So I think you would have much better training for officers and members, and much better conversations between them much earlier. One of the reasons we've had these big clashes is, I think Councillor Ward touched on it, and maybe Councillor Clark, the, if you like, the interpretation of paragraph 11 in the MPPF. And this has been a bone of contention because there's been lots of court cases that people have quoted, and we felt that officers were not up to speed with really and truly what was going on in the courts. So, you know, I'm not saying we were right, I'm not saying the officers are wrong, I don't know. What I'm saying is that had we worked together, we would not have arrived in a committee meeting and had a clash that we had, because we would have known. The reports have got to be better. Now, this was something that was, I think it was in the peer review, it may have been in some other PAS, but we did for a while change the format of reports, make them simpler, make them more repetitive. And certainly if you're dealing with a householder one, a simple extension, you know, it's a different report from an outline or a reserve matters one on something for 146 homes. So, you know, I think that the better reports would certainly free up time, because if officers are being, I think they're too risk averse, to be honest. I think there's a huge mentality in Waverley of let's do absolutely everything just in case, which is great, really. But when you're in a position of needing to do things quickly, then you have to alter your practices. So I actually don't think this is solving an issue. I didn't think it was solving an issue when it was first thrown at us at the last council meeting. I would do anything in my power to help Waverley get itself back on its feet in terms of planning, but I do not see how taking local democracy out of planning adds to anything to it. And as for helping residents, I mean, you know, we all know we can give advice, but we can't give opinion. I mean, it's not really that difficult. And if you really have gone over the mark, then you just have to withdraw from the meeting. I mean, it's most of us have had to withdraw at some point, either because we're married to somebody who's been involved or whatever. You know, I mean, it's just one of those things, and it keeps everything fair and in the eyes of the public that we are being fair. So if I had some hard evidence that the local committee, the committees as we have them at the moment, the geographical committees, were really the problem, and if I really thought that DLUC is going to look at that and say, oh my goodness me, what an improvement, they are not. They are going to look at the statistics they always look at. And if we are improving, and we're told we are, and if we continue to improve, that is what's going to get us out of the danger we're in. But in the meantime, we've just got to get everything better. Don't have to throw, I honestly think this is a bit of a futile gesture rather than something that is genuinely going to do what we need, which is to speed up, to make better decisions, better training, because I certainly think there are people sitting on planning committees who really don't know the local plan, you know, just have no idea really about what plan-led actually means. Somebody told me once I was trumped up with policy and I should go from the heart. I remember that in one meeting, which was unfortunately webcast. But, you know, it has to be a fair system, fair for everybody, fair for the applicants, fair for residents who are affected by any application that comes in. But fairness comes from knowledge. It comes from local knowledge. It comes from really good planning. What's what I'm looking for? Information. We need to have better training, really better training. Somebody I remember years ago suggested we had a written exam on the local plan. I don't know if anyone remembers that. And I think it was a sort of bit of a grumble around the chamber, but you know, and I'm not advocating that, by the way. But you know, the point they were trying to make was, if you don't know your plans, if you don't know your policies, how are you going to make informed decisions? So, you know, I think it's better training, better reports, better control of the agenda. I just think when we fix dates, we stick to dates. When we fix the agenda, we stick to it. The number of meetings last year which were ripped up at the last minute, or we drove all the way over here and 2 items have been removed and we looked at somebody's shed or something. You know, it's this sort of thing that it is just unnecessary, costly, and doesn't do it. So I'm sorry, I still think until I've seen evidence that the status quo is not the answer, I will stay with the status quo and let local members do what I think they do best. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coburn. Would you like to respond, Claire, to anything that Councillor Coburn said?
I think just, and probably it's to the whole committee, you know, I'm not suggesting this afternoon that changing to one committee is going to solve all our problems. And it's been really useful this afternoon listening to some of your feedback on the issues that you've experienced with planning. So I just want to just sort of reiterate that, you know, I think it is part of the solution, but I do think there is an awful lot of other work that needs to be done to make us become the planning authority I think we all want to be. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Claire. The Vice Chairman, Councillor Beanie, would like to speak now.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Obviously, it's quite plain that over the last few years, it hasn't worked, and we need to try and do something to change our committee structure. One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, I mean, we've had the statistics on appeals, for example. I got very involved in a matter down in Haslemere, and I found it very difficult, first of all, to give a view because of predetermination. So I would certainly welcome the idea that I don't have to give my view. I can speak at the committee. I can speak before the committee and tell people what I think and actually persuade people, I would hope, to look at the common sense. So I would be very much in favour of having the ward members speak, but not take a vote. I think that is a very good way ahead to allow us to influence the committee and to give our members and our community the idea that we really care about. So I would welcome that. However, when I got involved in that, and that is a good example, Waverley turned it down. And like everything, it went to appeal. The inspector upheld the appeal. Not because we'd done anything wrong as a committee, not because anything had been done by the officers. No, 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 no. Unfortunately, this is the tilted balance. Government figures telling us that we have to achieve a number of housing which we hadn't achieved. Therefore, they turned me down or the committee down and approved it. So we haven't mentioned that. I think we've got to be careful with some of these figures that they're not in our control, these appeal wins. We haven't spoken too much about the computer software that went wrong to begin with. And I would think that that cost us a lot of efficiency, a lot of speed. We're up to date now, so we can say that that computer system now hopefully is working in a much better direction. Do we talk about staff turnover? One of the problems we had in Weston was that you could be talking to a member of the staff about a planning, but then unfortunately that member had left. So we've got somebody else. Does that impact on speed? I think it does. Can we get it done in time? Because we've suddenly got a new member of staff advising us who's not necessarily up to speed. I certainly found staff turnover, but excuse me, a problem. The other thing I took note of the idea with one committee is, of course, the balance. Is it not better to have a committee that will give a decision that is fair right across the borough, rather than I do accept that when somebody's coming to Weston, members on that committee will think differently, I hope they do, to Easton. So some will be passed, some won't be. But at the end of the day, the idea is with planning, it's lines on a map. It does, though, give the ward councillors this opportunity to speak their own mind, both outside and inside of these committees. So I'm all in favour of it. Councillor Follows talk about Surrey County Council. Yes, I'm on that planning committee over at Surrey. I've only just joined. The first thing we did was get a minibus that they got a reasonable price, of course, and it was electric. It was all a new experience. And we went on a site visit, more or less the whole committee. And they shared views because some people knew their areas, some didn't. And then we get back to the council and that comes up at the meeting I went to this morning over at Surrey. And I found that a very good example of how a very large area could actually be looked after and decided upon by that number of councillors. So I personally would now say that a single committee is quite capable of looking after Waverley, as long as those 15 members will work hard, and that is a problem time. I accept that, but I think that way ahead will at least show the government, we are looking at what we are doing and changing because it's the borough that counts. We must do something so we don't get into this horrible area of the government telling us what we should do. Because we are nearly there, aren't we, with developers now, where because of this tilted balance, then they are telling us what we can and cannot do. And we certainly don't want to go there. I think that's what I wanted to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think Councillor Peter Nicholson wishes to speak now.
Thank you. Yes, Chairman. Well, other members have eloquently made all the points in detail back and forward, so I'll restrict myself to a couple of points. First one is, if I had to describe the benefits of the new committee in one word, that word would be consistency. I think that's important to have. The second point, which others have mentioned, but I think it's worth mentioning again, and this is obviously members have concern about, is how can they represent their own wards? Well, in this new system, you will be able to fully explain both before and afterwards. And as pointed to me, Ms. by Councillor Rubini, and I think that is certainly worthwhile mentioning. So that's my 2 points. Thank you very much.
I think there's two councillors who haven't spoken yet. Do you either wish to speak? Councillor Reid first.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I was biding my time as a new councillor and listening to the debate intently. But we've had a lot of eloquent speeches, but I think that we have perhaps forgotten the purpose of why we are here today. And that is to make a decision against what I see as some officer recommendations backed up by some external consultants in PAS. And we need to make a decision as councillors whether we are going to pick up on one of those officer recommendations. Now, I'm not going to go into the whys and wherefores of who is correct and who isn't, and where's the evidence for all of that, because that's just a minefield that we're going to open for everyone to look at. We have a decision to make, and if we do not change from where we are today, my perception, then we are going to be designated. We've got to show that we are doing something. It was interesting listening to some of the comments that there seemed to be a lot of people who felt that we should have the area committees. But there was one speaker who said that there were, at one point, all major applications were dealt with by what I think was called a joint planning committee. And that was a borough-wide committee, and they made good decisions. And that was on the major applications. I see no reason at all why a joint committee, which is what a borough-wide committee would be, making those same wise decisions. A few areas that we haven't touched on, and I think that, and they were mentioned in the report, and I think maybe, although we don't do it now for this evening's council meeting, it is something that should be considered. And I have always, or for some time now, been of the opinion that councillors set up the local plan. They decide on planning policy. I believe that there should be more and more officers' application to those policies that have been decided by councillors. Why councillors have to come in and have a second bite of the cherry? They've set the policy. If the planners apply that policy, everything should be fine. And I know there's not just the local plan, there's the neighbourhood plan, and there's the NPPF. but let's apply those policies. So I think that this committee at some stage should consider to say that householder applications, and I think that was mentioned in the report, should be determined by officers, shouldn't ever come to a committee. So we're only talking about the larger applications. I think that we do have to trial this one committee across the whole of the borough. And I think representation can be good from each area because you have the right people on the committee. They can present their view. And I do support the idea because I've fallen, I was going to say fallen foul of it, but I think you understand what I mean. I've had difficulties with residents in the past whose neighbour has been putting in a planning application and they want me to commit in one particular direction, and being on a planning committee, you're not able to do so. So I would support that idea as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Does Councillor Gemma Long wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, having listened to everybody's proposals today, I conclude that I support the single committee, and I found very compelling the speeches about ward councillors not voting in their wards. I would like to consider more the comment that Councillor Goodridge made about voting on officer recommendations without having an alternative in place, because that struck me as something that should merit further consideration.
Would you like to comment on that, Claire, if we should consider that further?
I'd agree that, you know, we're getting clear feedback that it's not working the way, and we need to make sure that we have got the constitution and the planning probity and protocols are clear and work, and ensure that we are making clear, robust decisions. So
thank you, Claire.
If I could have permission to come back. We're being asked on the one hand to do something, or shows that we're doing something so that we can satisfy the powers of be in Westminster. I mean, I think getting on, I don't see why we can't get on and do the changes to the planning procedure rules now, whether we've got to leave it. In principle, to change or to remove 210 and 211 and replace it with what the PAS suggested to us at the training. The one thing that's worrying me, I mean, I agree with John, my Councillor Ward. I mean, I take the view that a joint committee and the two area committees is the ideal solution. What's worrying me is if there is a single committee, and I would refer councillors to paragraph 7.1 on page 24 of the PAS report, all of the paragraph. I mean, they're talking about, it's quite unusual for a council of Waverley's size to have more than one planning committee, and how many meetings and so on. It then talks about, I mean, the planning applications aren't going to disappear with the volume of, if we don't change the scheme of delegation, we're going to have exactly the same number of planning applications, but all piled into one meeting, or, you know, instead of having Eastern and Western, we're going to have two meetings of the main planning committee a month to carry, you know, to get through the backlog. And it says here, it may be beneficial to review the criteria for referral and exclude more minor applications, such as householder development altogether. In other words, all neighbour problems or extensions to houses will all be dealt with by officers and not dealt with by members, which I think would be a disaster as well. So I'm concerned about how we're going to deal with the volume if there is one committee only. I mean, I dread to be on it. I mean, if we take 2 or 3 hours to deal with 4 or 5 applications, and the main committee has, if one committee is going to have 8 or 9 to deal with to get through the backlog, they're going to be there all night. and then the quality of decision-making deteriorates the longer the meeting lasts, in my experience. As you get hungry and irritable and looking at cocoa and it's time to go home. And therefore, I am concerned that on the volume of work, if we change it to one committee, I'm still not convinced that we need to change the committee structure, but I do think we could change now the procedures, which I think are one of the problems that the committees have. Why can't we deal with it now?
If I could ask Susan to comment on that, if she would.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair. So we're picking up a lot of feedback, which as Claire said, is very useful to have the feedback, both about the scheme of delegations and about the planning procedure rules. All I would say is there's a suggestion to amend 2 particular specific paragraphs in those planning procedure rules this evening. It's not an item that was on the agenda. It's not contained in the report before you, and officers haven't had the opportunity to advise you on such a proposal. And even if they had, I would urge caution about looking at 2 isolated specific paragraphs. I think the procedure rules probably need to be reviewed in their entirety. And I don't disagree that perhaps they are ready for a review, but I would suggest perhaps the committee invite a report back at a future time to have a look at the procedure rules in their entirety with a detailed report containing some officer advice. I think I would say a similar comment about the delegations and the volume of work for one committee, that there's been a lot of discussion about the volume of work and whether it would be reduced by one committee. I think the scheme of delegations does need a review. Again, it's a major piece of work. And I think the Standards Committee would want to consider that very carefully before making any amendments to it with some detailed officer advice. So it might be something that the Standards Committee want to put on their work programme for later in the year.
Can I ask for it to be ASAP rather than pushed into the long grass? We have an urgent situation here with the risk that this council's being put at. This is something we've got to get on with, not push into long grass and put on the agenda for some time.
Could I ask Susan to comment if it would be appropriate for us to make that as a recommendation to the council that we have a review of the scheme of delegation and that it becomes back to this committee.
Through you, Chair, you certainly could, or you could simply make one of your recommendations this evening that you request a report back yourselves as this committee on those items from officers, and you could put a timescale on that if that's what you wanted to do.
I think we should do that. I'm concerned about the time, actually. I was very happy to allow people to talk, as Councillor Ward said, as long as possible. But we're now at 10 to 6 and the council meeting's at 7. So I think we've got to move towards coming to conclusions. One of the things that I'd point out is that there's some things come up during the discussion that we can possibly all agree on, or we might want to come to a decision on. Things like, regardless of what the committee structure is, the report recommends that executive members shouldn't be actually on the planning committees. And I haven't had anyone disagree with that. So we can make that as a recommendation to the council. The report talks about substitutes being available. Any properly trained member can substitute if he's from the same political group. And that seems a sensible idea. Have people agreed to that as well?
Agreed.
So that's the second thing we're agreed with. Councillor Ward and I think others have suggested that we should recommend a review after a year of whatever we decide to do, or whatever the council decides to do. We all agreed that that would be a good recommendation to the full council. Is there any other item like that, Susan? Because you listed some of them at the beginning, like that I've missed, that the committee might agree on.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So just to clarify as well, the review back in a year's time, would that be a report back to the Standards Committee?
Yes, I think it would be.
You're asking for a report back to this committee.
That's what I'm asking for, yes.
And then I think the other items that it would be useful if the committee made a decision on would be well, the number of committees themselves,
Yeah.
the number of seats on that committee, the name. You've dealt with executive members not being on the committee, and you've dealt with substitutes being trained. And the other issue is ward members being able to speak.
Okay, well, if we can discuss that one actually, because I'm not sure everyone agreed not to speak as members of the committee. If they happen to be on the committee, to speak as ward members, in other words, to stand back from being a voting member, and as any ward member can do, speak at the beginning and speak at the end. Some people thought that was a good idea. I'm not sure anyone was totally against it. I think Councillor Goodrich, Councillor.
Sorry, I wouldn't say I'm totally against it, but in terms of time, it frightens the life out of me, because I mean, if you've got, you know, I don't know, half a dozen items on the agenda, and each person who's in that ward opts, and maybe two, oh, I suppose they'll only get 4 minutes, won't they? They still only get 4 minutes between you, presumably. But you know, you're adding up sort of a, you know, 8 minutes extra, well, 4 minutes extra, because if they stayed on the committee. So I am a little bit worried about encouraging ward members to opt out and then come along and speak twice. Strikes me as a bit dangerous in terms of time, if that's one of the things we're trying to achieve.
Would anybody like to respond to that, Councillor Ward?
It wasn't actually a response to that. It was just, I think probably now is the time to put things to the vote rather than further discussion. But I'm happy to chat forever, but I'm actually hoping to have a quick snack before council.
Councillor Reid?
Sorry, Chairman, I was just saying I agree with the last comment.
Okay. Well, we haven't.
Chairman, I think we need to be quite clear. It seems my reading of the Constitution is that if we do exclude ward members, in my ward, for example, I have 3 in my ward, and I think the rules will provide, and I'm happy to be corrected by the monitoring officer, all 3 could speak at the beginning, all 3 could sum up. It doesn't restrict it down to 4 minutes between all 3. It would be 4 minutes each twice.
Okay.
So it would be 24 minutes. On
on
my arithmetic, if we have one in my ward that we don't like.
That would be if all 3 board members were on the planning committee, yes?
No.
Or if they were overwhelmed, yeah. Okay, I understand what you're saying. So I'm not sure we can come to a decision on that one at this point in time. We need to move to a decision about the committee structure.
I agree. Just very briefly, is it really necessary for all people to speak 4 minutes before that? Could they work together and perhaps one person put forward a case for 4 minutes and another put forward for 2 minutes? Could they plan what they want to say? That you don't have to speak. It's not an iron rule that you must always speak for 4 minutes before or after. There's a little bit discipline, perhaps. Thank you.
I mean, this was in the officer's report, so very briefly, Claire, do you want to comment on it, if you don't mind? And then we must move to the structure of the committees.
Yeah, so I think the suggestion has been made that, you know, board members are all going to say the same thing, then they could work together and say it once rather than potentially 3 times.
Councillor Ward.
Can we just say 4 minutes will be available to ward members in total to speak?
Yes.
Yeah, at the beginning and
You're going to have to change the Constitution if you are, because the Constitution does not provide that.
That's correct. Fiona.
Through you, Chair. That procedure rule, as it currently stands, allows any number of ward members to come along speak currently. So it wouldn't be any different from the current situation. And we tend not to find that. It's if there is not a ward member on the committee, one will come along, but most of our wards sort of prior to the change in the boundaries had 2 ward members, some had 3. We didn't find in practice all 3 turning up to speak at committee. So I don't think that it's a procedure rule that's not specific to the planning committees, other than the right to come back. So I think we would need to take a lot of care about changing that on the fly this evening, just in relation to the planning committees, because it's not a situation that would suddenly materialise in a new planning committee regime. It's been there anyway.
On a point of information, I mean, when you have Eastern planning, I might be on the committee representing my village, and somebody who's not on the planning committee representing the village next door. We're all going to be we're all now in the same ward. And therefore, what I was saying is that in theory, not necessarily in practice, but in theory, all three could attend, could all speak for the maximum amount of time and sum up. That's what we could do. Now, not necessarily will that happen, because I think we've got better things to do. But I'm just saying, it's not just 8 minutes, it could be more.
But if we restrict ward members speaking as Councillor Ward suggested for 4 minutes between them, if you like, they have to coordinate in the same way as objectors have to actually coordinate.
You'd have to change the constitution if you're going to do that.
Okay. Okay. Councillor Reid.
Chairman, I really do think this is a bit of a red herring. If it becomes an issue, then we will have to deal with it when it becomes an issue. But let's see if it becomes an issue. We've wasted enough time today in this committee talking about things that don't need to be considered today. Let's get to the crux of it, please.
But we have to. So. Okay, so in terms of that particular item of the right of ward members to speak, are we going to have a vote on that? I think we have to do that. So let's put that to the vote. Do members agree with the officer's recommendation that ward members should actually stand back from being members of the committee and not vote on items within their own ward? Who agrees that that should happen? Those who disagree? Well, that is carried. Okay, that's the first thing we've had to actually have a vote on and disagree. I rather hope that we could come to agreement on everything, but clearly from the speeches we had so far, that's not going to happen. I probably should briefly say what my own view is in the whole thing. I'm a little bit conflicted about it, rather like Councillor Ward, actually. I see the advantage of local members having local views and bringing that to committees and so on. But overall, like Councillor Ward, I actually feel that we should actually be moving towards a single committee. And I guess one of my main reasons for that is that we spoke a lot about the danger of designation in relation to the speed issue, that in terms of the PAS report. There's also a very considerable danger of designation if we actually keep losing appeals. And it looks to me as if the present situation is causing us to lose more and more appeals. And that doesn't help anybody, in fact. So that's my own reason why I think we should go for the single committee. But we've got three options in front of us, actually. There's the status quo. Do we wish to continue with the two regional committees? That there's actually the A and B suggestion from the officers as one alternative, and there's a single committee option. I haven't heard anyone speak actually in favour of the A and B option particularly. So does anyone actually favour that option? In fact, and a member of the committee, would anyone wish to vote for that or support that? So I think we can discount that option. So what we're actually talking about now is the decision of this committee between the single committee and continuing with the two regional committees. And it seems to me that we have to have a vote on that issue. And we all agree that that's the options that we need to be considering. Okay. One point I'd make about the two regional committees, if the people want to support that, would they still want it to be committees with the 15 size that they currently are, or would they wish it to be 11 as is suggested for the two A and B committee, just so we know what we're voting on? Are we talking about two 15-member committees, or are we talking about two 11-member committees? Is that those who support the two committees, is that what you'd be wishing to advocate?
From my point of view, Chairman, I would favour two committees, and I would favour it to be at the lower figure of 11, just to take into account the different amount of councillors that now exist.
Okay, so these are the two options in front of us. We're voting on, are we going to recommend to the council a single committee? Or are we going to recommend to the council the continuation of 2 regional committees, but reduced to 11 members? So those in favour of the single committee, please show. I'm not sure you have those in favour of the continuing the regional committees with 2 committees of 11. So that motion is carried, that we're advocating to the council a single committee. And again, we ought to briefly discuss whether or not we're happy with the recommendation for 15 members. Those who favour the single committee, are they in favour of 15 members? Thank you. So that's the recommendation to the full council. Well, we've managed to do it by 6 o'clock, which gives the officers an hour to come forward with a report of their recommendations to the full council. So Susan would like to say something.
Through you, Chair, can I just be clear? Has the committee made a decision to receive a report back in 1 year's time for a review?
Yes.
Is that agreed?
Yes.
And has the committee agreed to receive a report from officers on the planning procedure rules and schema delegations? Was that agreed?
That is agreed as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And one more suggestion through you, Chair, is would the committee be willing to agree a recommendation to recommend to council this evening the proportional allocation of committee seats arising from the change to the planning committee?
Yeah,
that's being proposed.
I think we have to do that. We've got no choice.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you all at 7 o'clock.